Okay. This analog stuff always trips me up. So speaking of diversity, another interesting opportunity, if you know people who would be interested in it, is a few years ago I went to what was then called Hacker School and is now called Recurse Center. And it's in New York City, and it's a 6 or 12-week retreat. And they're doing diversity scholarships up to $10,000 per person. It's free to go to Recurse Center, but living in New York City is sometimes not quite as free. So that can be very helpful. I think Vlad, where's Vlad? Vlad, are you here? Oh, there's Vlad. Vlad also went to Recurse Center. So, okay. Oh, and yeah, I think they have 1, 6, and 12-week batches. Okay, well, I was not paid for that promotional message. Speaking of Caucasian males, last night on Twitter, there was some venture capitalist who posted a thread about so-called 10x programmers, and it was like the most, I don't know if he was intentionally trolling and it was a parody, but it included various tropes about 10x programmers and how awesome they are, and if you're a startup founder, you should grab one of them. And one of the things he said is you can tell a 10x programmer because their screen background is black. They use a dark background. Okay. There we go. Yeah. So, I mean, we could do black, but okay. I don't know. I think white will be more readable. Okay. So, actually, 5 years ago was the last time I spoke about Racket mode at RacketCon. This was a couple years after I had started to work on it. And I mean, I don't like to toot my own horn, but I think if you talk to people, you will hear it has a reputation as one of the most interesting and captivating talks at RacketCon that really anyone has ever experienced. And I just have if I can find it here, yeah, a short clip. So here I am. Here I'm kind of like typing away, just doing my little stuff. And I could just watch this like for forever. This is like pretty awesome. Yes. Okay. Enough making fun of Matthias. So they didn't invite me back for 5 years, so obviously it was the worst presentation. No, the truth, of course, is that there have been many very cool people doing many cool things in the Racket community, and there have been an awesome 5 years of presentations since then. So moving this along, 1 slide per minute or even quicker, Racket mode uses Emacs and Racket. It supports some fairly old versions of Emacs and Racket, so that if you're using a distribution in which those are what is available, we still support them. In the time since I've been working on it, there have been about 900 commits and a few hundred closed issues. So in comparison to Racket itself, that's a drop in the bucket. It's been a lot of fun, though, and I do dog food it every day, almost every day, and use it myself. The basic design is there's an Emacs Lisp front end, and that consists of a variety of major and minor modes. Racket mode itself is for editing Racket files. Racket REPL mode is a REPL, and there are some other assorted modes. And I should probably make this slightly smaller. And then there's a backend, which is in Racket. So in the beginning, Racket mode was a pretty thin wrapper over sending xrepl commands into a process buffer. And so, that worked pretty well. Enter a module, and so on and so forth. It started to fall apart when I wanted to do commands like, hey, I would like the HTML for some bit of Racket functionality. And the funny thing about HTML is sometimes there's a closing bracket, like a greater than symbol to close a tag, and that looks an awful lot like a prompt that is sometimes in the REPL. And so this whole strategy of trying to multiplex output from the program and responses to commands was obviously a little error prone. It was kind of amazing it worked as well as it did. So the next iteration here was, well, I'll write the stuff to a special file, the command output, and that avoided the multiplexing problem. But still, this was one command and response at a time. And what if the user is doing a read in the program also, because we're still using standard in and standard out. So the latest iteration, and this is probably obvious in hindsight, but I was trying to be very incremental and avoid second system syndrome, is there is a little TCP server. It's not doing HTTP. There's one TCP connection at a time. You can have multiple commands in flight. And they're simply subsets of valid S expressions that would be valid in both Emacs and Racket, which is kind of an interesting thing to figure out sometimes. And then that's basically the mechanism there. The full match statement for the commands is something like this. So it's not a ton, but there are commands to run a file and to get symbol information and to use the stepping debugger and blah, 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 blah. So you have seen X expressions and match statements before. What happens when you run a file? A lot like when you are using Dr. Racket, we dynamic require a relative module path, use module to namespace to get inside the module and all the interesting, tasty definitions in there. Every run uses a fresh custodian and namespace and releases resources. And in some cases, we do instrument the code using error trace lib for various things like profiling or test coverage or step debugging. So unlike Dr. Racket, we load Racket GUI lazily, because if you're in Emacs and say you're just working on texty programs, it can be kind of annoying to have a dedicated Racket GUI window pop up. One thing we do differently from Dr. Racket is there is one REPL that is shared among all the file buffers. That's not ideal, but it certainly keeps life simple. One thing we do in Racket mode that's a little different is you can put point, what Emacs calls the cursor, inside of any submodule form. And if you run that, it will run that submodule. And so if you have a test or a main or some other type of submodule, it's kind of handy to be able to do that. Another thing that I've experimented with that I think is kind of handy is if you get a syntax error, it will actually try to convert your program into a skeleton of just the definitions and the names, so require and define forms, and see if it can actually evaluate that without an error. And if it can, then things like completion and visit definition will still work. So that was because sometimes I would be editing a file, there's a mistake, it would be handy to use completion, but I can't because the syntax errors prevented that. Okay, so Racket mode, how's it delivered? There's a whole bunch of Emacs Lisp code and a whole bunch of Racket code. What are our choices for how to get that to users? One choice would be each could be its own package. There could be an Emacs package with the Emacs stuff. There could be a Racket package with that. Some modes for Emacs use that approach. I found that to be a little error prone because sometimes they get out of sync, and you need to be very careful to have the correct version of both packages. So for today, the current least worst answer is it is delivered as an Emacs package on Melpa, and the Racket code comes along for the ride and is then installed. Some recent improvements during the last year. This is more from summer and also this May. I added a very experimental step debugger, a UI for the macro stepper, and I did some more things with the documentation. The debugger is definitely experimental quality, super tiny demo. Actually, we have that queued up. Okay, so here's a Racket file. Not sure how the window split will be. That's not ideal. Okay, so it ran the file. This is simply a function that does some silly computations. We call the function with 41. It returns the value 174. If you Control U, Control U, Control C, Control C, now the cursor is red. And if you use the spacebar, you can pop through. We're now inside the F function. There's a little overlay here showing the current value of X is 41. As we navigate through here, we get the results of intermediate expressions. Also, if you go down into the REPL, which is emitting a ton of little prompts here, those expressions, even local variables, are available for use, so you can explore those and do things. And if you come back up to the debugger, you can keep going. And that ran automatically because calling f is at the top level of this file, but that file is still instrumented, so you could call f with some other value and go through the whole thing all over again. I'll hit continue and run. So that's pretty fun. I haven't actually used this myself as much as I expected. There's something about Println that is just so, so nice. So I don't hold this up and say throw anything at it and it will work amazingly. But if you do try it and experience any problems, let me know. And if it's something easy to fix, I will do that. And if it's hard to fix, I'll try as well. Let's see here. Presentation. We did that. Macro stepper. I won't do a demo of this. This is just simply an interface to the macro stepper's text UI, and it shows the diffs using the diff3 algorithm, so closer to what you would see with git diff output. Someone said, "Oh, it saved someone's butt this week." So, yeah, cool. That's cool. Something else I did more recently was redo the documentation to write a guide. And I spent a good week and a half going back and forth on whether I should do this in Scribble or org mode. And it was difficult. For now, I did it in org mode. And the user guide in org mode includes another org mode file that is generated by some eLisp file. And that goes through for all the definitions and takes the doc strings and tries to make passable org mode stuff out of them. And then that generates a tech info file, which can generate an info file that is delivered on users' local Emacs when it's installed. And it's also used to generate an HTML file. And I did not set up internet here, so this might still be cached in the browser. I guess it is. And so that's a file like this. And I spent way too much time on the CSS for the keystrokes. I wanted them to look like black keys with white lettering on front. But otherwise, it is the same text. Okay, so interlude or digression. Interlude is the probably better dramatic thing. But what is the sound of one print line? So we have a very short Racket program here, lang Racket, begin for syntax, print line 1. And of course, if you run command line Racket, it does what you expect. It prints 1. But one day I woke up and had a little bug on Racket mode that, no, when you run that program, it prints 1 2 times. And I said, well, that's interesting. I'll go check what Dr. Racket does. And the answer is it prints it 3 times. So from this, I can conclude that Racket mode is twice as good as command line Racket, but there's still a significant gap in the print line feature space to catch up with Dr. Racket. Okay, and this is getting towards the end of my talk, but seriously, what could I do with Racket mode going forward? I think today it's a pretty good lang Racket mode, but it's definitely not attempting to be a lang Racket as a programming language mode. And what would be required to do that is basically 3 things, as far as I can tell. One would be to submit the Dr. Racket submit predicate, which lets you handle languages where expressions are not S expressions, and they might be delimited in some other way. Support for Dr. Racket and a language's color lexer, and support for a language's special indentation. So the REPL submit thing, I actually did a while ago. There are a few edge cases I still need to figure out where certain things are using end of file as a separator, but basically it works. Syntax highlighting. Emacs calls this font lock because it's Emacs. Why would it call it syntax highlighting? And so we could use a lang supplied color lexer. I think, and I should try this, and I haven't had time to, but my main concern would be the speed across this TCP boundary. That might actually not be too bad. And then I'm also wondering, will using this color text class or interface force loading Racket GUI? That would kind of be unfortunate because I've been trying really hard not to load it. But so I want to look into that a little bit. And then finally, indentation. A language can supply an indentation functionality. Here again, one concern might be speed, maybe even more so because as you're doing local frequent edits and new lines, you wouldn't want that to be slow. But I think my other question here is, why should indentation be only a property of a language? I mean, if I write a library, it's not a language, just a plain old library, and I define some special syntax, maybe that should have some special indentation. So I'm not entirely sure if language is the right place or level of granularity to do special indentation. On the other hand, I have no idea how it would work for a library. Would it be some new kind of submodule, like doc time and test time and run time? Would there be indentation time? You know, would that be, or, so I don't really know, and maybe we can have a quick conversation tomorrow with some people who know better. Anyway, in the meantime, in the status quo is you can still do the sort of time-honored Emacs tradition of putting little variables local variables into your file, and you can customize those per file and per directory. So there's this little hacky workaround. And I am hitting the right key to advance to the slide that says, thank you for your time. Apparently, I managed to delete that slide. So I have no final slide. And in lieu of that, I will just say thank you for your time. And I don't know if we have time for questions, but thank you.
Thanks. That was very instructive. Have you looked at the Nrepl protocol at all? For what you've mentioned with the connection over TCP sounds a lot like Nrepl,
Yep.
which is supposed to be language agnostic.
Yep.
So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that. Yeah,
that's a great question. There is Nrepl. There is also the language server protocol. So in a past life, I did music software, and there was a plugin architecture called VST that worked with Cubase. And other programs could use it, but at the end of the day, the specification for VST was really, does it work in Cubase? And so I'm a little concerned about the language server protocol. Some experiences people have had trying to implement that for different languages. So that might be a little too bleak or pessimistic, but I think it's worth looking at. And I know some people, Dre's up there now because he has the microphone, have indeed been working on that. So that, like in theory, that's the correct way to do it. And maybe in reality, that will turn out to be the best way. In the meantime, S expressions, just kind of squirting them back and forth over a port is pretty fun. I mean, it's kind of nice. Yes.
Hey, I want to thank you for the work you've done here. This is awesome, and actually, there's a bunch of conversations that I want to have offline. This one also is just a kind of a random point that occurred to me while you were talking. I can't do any better than this. There is that Microsoft indentation specification lang thingy madoodle, I think, right? That everyone uses, all the cool kids use now, and is there Emacs support for that? And what's up with that? If you know, or anybody knows anything about that.
Well, I thank you for thinking I'm one of the cool kids, and I would know about that. However, I'm not totally sure. I wonder if that could be the language server protocol, possibly. Language LSP, like Lisp, but without an I. Yeah, so that might be the thing, and yes.
Show us a stepper demo, a macro stepper demo.
I'm sorry, can you
show us the macro stepper demo with the diff3?
Okay, well, my first rule of giving demos is never give the demo that you haven't rehearsed for, but let's see. Can I remember I don't use it enough for the keystrokes. So what do we got? No, I don't want to set the coding system. I would like to run a command and expand. Yeah, why don't we do expand definition? I think that's fine. So there are a couple different flavors of this, but basically you manage your Emacs windows properly, and you can step, and it is in this fashion, and you can go back and forth. So it's not nearly as fancy as what Dr. Racket is doing, but this was more. Also, it provides a quick interface for plain old expand as well as the macro stepper. Full file, full module expansion with a consistent UI.
I like it.
Yep.
I would go so far to say it's more fancy in some ways because you
Yeah, the same UI will work both for just an individual expression or the full macro stepper analysis. Okay,
Right,
well, that demo didn't fail, so that was good. Yes.
Yes. So I will be the young, naive student who dares to ask, as someone who has not used Emacs, what would you recommend, or what features would it has that might be helpful to me, or why should I go in that direction?
Why even Emacs? Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I don't feel like super evangelical about it. I think I would say that, for example, a few years ago when Rust was still a brand new language, there was probably it might have been a baby Rust mode, but there was probably a Rust mode that made it easier to work with Rust. And so, for example, if you're kind of a polyglot and you like to jump around and play with lots of different programming languages, some of which are not mature enough to have an IDE yet, Emacs can be a nice choice because there's probably someone somewhere who cares enough about that language to do an Emacs mode for it. Also, I think some people in an office use Microsoft Excel as this kind of multi-tool and bend it in all sorts of ways to get things done. And I don't know if many Emacs users would appreciate the comparison, but I think in a way, Emacs can be the same kind of power tool. And finally, if you jump around operating systems, like I spend most of my day in Firefox and Emacs, and most of the day I don't even really know or care if I'm on Windows or Mac OS or Linux. More recently, it happens to be Linux, and by the way, I use Ubuntu. I don't use Arch, so no. So, I mean, I think that's kind of nice too. You can even do file operations in Emacs and not have to worry so much about the local conventions. So, if it might be one of those things that you try and you don't like it, and a year later you try it again and you still don't like it, and the third time maybe it clicks with you. So it won't make you a better programmer. It's not like some secret magical thing, but a lot of people find it really fun. The main downside is kind of dot file obsession, that you can tinker with your configuration and start yak shaving and get lost and forget what you were trying to do originally. So that can be a danger, and I think that I go through cycles of kind of inhaling and exhaling with that, where I polish my setup and then remember to do work, and so.
That was the most subdued endorsement of Emacs I've ever heard. Greg is a truly unique Emacs user for saying this. Let's thank him so much.